Imagine you're living in a perfect marriage, or at least, that's what you think. Your wife is always smiling, caring, but over time, you begin to notice little things. She's become more reserved, often goes out for long meetings, and seems to be hiding her phone from you. And then, one day, you receive a message that changes everything. It's not just rumors or suspicions, it's something more. It all starts with one question. What if I find out the truth? How will you react when it's revealed that what you thought was normal is actually a big lie? Can you forgive? What happens when you decide to learn more than you planned? The answer to this question might completely change your perspective on everything happening around you. She cheated on me and blamed me for it. My revenge shut her up for good. Fred was sitting in his small home workshop when he heard the sound of a text notification on the phone. He always left his phone on the shelf by the door, so this sound felt odd. Chloe's phone was usually in their bedroom, but she had gone to take a shower, leaving it on the kitchen table. The notification sounded again, this time with a loud vibration that seemed to pierce the silence in the house. Fred walked past the kitchen, deciding to ignore it, but then something inside him clicked. Pure curiosity. He knew he shouldn't touch his wife's phone, but his hand moved toward it on its own. On the screen was a message that read, "The evening was amazing. When can we do it again? Those guys were so good." Next to the text was a contact named Katie. Fred thought it was strange. He didn't know Chloe had a friend named Katie. And what could this message mean? The evening? Do it again? Who were the guys she was writing about? He set the phone back down, trying to force himself to forget what he saw, but his mind was already spinning with theories. When Chloe came out of the shower, he stood by the window, staring out at the street. "How was your day?" she asked, towel-drying her hair. "Fine. And yours?" he replied without turning his head. "Oh, lots of work, nothing exciting," she chuckled lightly. Her laughter sounded too easy. Fred noticed it, but chose to remain silent. Later that evening, as he lay in bed trying to fall asleep, the message kept playing over and over in his mind. He realized he couldn't just ignore it. The next morning, when Chloe went to the store, Fred picked up her phone again. This time, he opened the chat with Katie. The conversation looked normal enough until he came across one message. "I'm still thinking about that moment at the hotel. Wish it could happen again." Fred felt a heavy weight press on his chest. He tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a joke. Maybe Katie was a real friend, and they were talking about something innocent. But the more he read, the fewer doubts he had. "Your husband doesn't seem to suspect a thing," Katie wrote. "You're a real genius." When Chloe returned home, Fred was already sitting in the living room, her phone in his hand. "Were you looking for something?" she asked, noticing his face. "Who's Katie?" he asked coldly. Surprise flickered in her eyes before quickly shifting to a faint smile. "She's a friend from my previous job," she answered, as though it were the most obvious fact in the world. "A friend who says she wants to be with you at a hotel again?" Her smile vanished. "You're reading my messages? That's a violation of trust, Fred." She sounded outraged, but he could tell her outrage was overly theatrical. "That doesn't answer my question," he said, trying to stay calm. Chloe suddenly looked uncertain, but quickly found something to say. "You don't trust me at all. If that's the case, maybe we should rethink our relationship." She turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving him sitting in silence. Fred knew he had to find the truth. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, he decided to follow her. He watched as she got into her car and drove toward the city. He followed at a distance, trying not to be noticed. She stopped at a cafe, got out of the car, and went inside. A few minutes later, a man Fred had never seen before joined her. They sat at a table by the window, talking and laughing. The man leaned in closer, and Chloe placed her hand on his shoulder. Fred felt his heart tighten. He could no longer wait. He stepped out of his car and entered the cafe. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly as he approached their table. Chloe turned sharply, her face turning pale. "Fred, what are you doing here?" "That's what I should be asking you. Who is this?" The man looked confused. I'm just a friend," he started. "A friend meeting my wife at a cafe?" Chloe began to say something, but Fred raised his hand to stop her. "You've always been a good manipulator, Chloe," he said, looking her straight in the eyes. But this time, you've gone too far. He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her sitting there in silence. Fred couldn't know for sure what was happening between them, but he was certain this was only the tip of the iceberg. Chloe drove into the driveway and parked the car in its usual spot. When she entered the house, Fred was sitting on the living room couch, holding a cup of tea. He looked up when he heard the door open, but said nothing. Sensing the tension in the air, Chloe removed her coat and carefully placed her bag on a chair near the entrance. "Hi," she greeted as she approached him. "How was your day?" "It passed," Fred replied shortly, without looking at her. Chloe stopped, suspecting something was bothering him. "Did something happen to you at the cafe? Why are you acting so strange? Are you jealous of me?" she asked, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. Fred finally looked at her. His eyes were cold. "Yes, something did happen," he said, placing his cup on the table. "Care to explain who that man at the cafe was?" Chloe visibly tensed, but quickly regained her composure. "Oh, Fred, that's an old friend," she began. "We went to university together. I haven't seen him in years, and he randomly messaged me a few weeks ago. We decided to meet up and catch up. Nothing more." Fred looked at her, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. "Why didn't you tell me you were going to meet him?" he asked. "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this," Chloe sighed. "You don't need to worry so much. Why don't you trust me like you used to?" Fred stood up from the couch and stepped closer to her. "Maybe it's because I feel like you've been pulling away from me lately," he said. "You're always busy, and even when we're home together, it's like you're somewhere else. And then there's this texting with your friend Katie." Chloe looked surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I saw your messages with Katie," Fred replied. "She mentioned some men too. That confused me." Chloe hesitated for a moment, but then smiled. "Fred, are you serious? Katie just loves to joke around. That's just the kind of person she is. If you want, I'll introduce you to her, and you'll see she didn't mean anything by it." "You really don't need to worry about this," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Let's just spend time together. Isn't that what you want?" Fred calmed down a little. He looked into her eyes, searching for sincerity, and it seemed like he found it. "Okay," he said, hugging her. "Maybe I am overthinking things." "That's better," Chloe said softly. "Everything will be fine." The next few days passed peacefully. Fred and Chloe started spending more time together. They went for walks, watched movies in the evenings, and even cooked dinner together. But deep down, Fred still felt that something wasn't right. His suspicions were like a faint noise in the background, never letting him fully relax. One day, while Chloe was in the shower, the phone caught his attention again. He picked it up and saw a new message from Katie. "You handled it perfectly. The main thing is not to get caught, and everything will go as we planned." Fred froze. He read the message several times, trying to understand its meaning. What had they planned? And what was this about not getting caught? When Chloe came out of the shower, Fred was standing there, holding the phone in his hand. "What is this?" he asked, showing her the screen. Chloe turned pale but quickly regained her composure. "Fred, are you snooping through my phone again?" she said indignantly. "It's just another one of Katie's jokes. She likes teasing me." "Another joke?" he repeated, looking at her skeptically. "Or another lie?" Chloe didn't reply, only giving him a challenging look. She turned and left the room. Fred couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His intuition told him there was an invisible crack forming in his relationship with Chloe. Lately, she had been going out often, explaining it with meetings with friends or errands he'd never heard of before. One day, as she was heading out for another outing, she left her bag on the kitchen table. Fred noticed the slightly open back. The clinking of metal caught his attention. He peeked inside and saw a set of keys he had never seen before. One of the keys had a tag engraved with an apartment number. This raised his suspicions because they didn't own any other property. When Chloe came home, he decided to ask her about it. "Chloe, what are these keys?" he asked, holding them in his hand. She paused for a moment, looking at him. Her face remained composed. "Oh, nothing special," she replied. "They're old keys to a friend's office. He asked me to hold on to them just in case." "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Fred asked. "I didn't think it was important," she replied with a slight shrug. It seems like you're starting to worry about small things. Fred decided not to escalate the situation, but his doubts only grew stronger. The next morning, while Chloe was in the bathroom, he picked up the keys again. Something about them wouldn't let him rest. After much deliberation, Fred decided to check out the address engraved on the key tag. Seizing the moment, he left the house and headed to the location. The apartment was in a modern building in the city center. He went to the indicated floor and inserted the key into the lock. It fit. The door opened, and he stepped inside. The apartment looked stylish but had a neutral, impersonal vibe, like a room in an expensive hotel. In the living room, there was a modern couch, and on the table sat a cup of half-finished coffee. He noticed a photograph of Chloe on a shelf, but next to her was a man Fred didn't recognize. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. He walked around the apartment, looking for more clues. On the nightstand in the bedroom, there was a gold bracelet he had once given Chloe for their anniversary. There was no doubt. She had been here. Fred decided the best course of action was to remain calm and avoid jumping to conclusions. He returned home and acted as if nothing had happened. Over the next few days, he kept observing her behavior. Chloe seemed unaware that Fred knew something was off. One day, Fred decided to call Katie, the friend Chloe often mentioned in her stories. "Hi, Katie. This is Fred, Chloe's husband," he began. "I've been wanting to meet you for a while, but I have a question for you. It might seem strange, but do you know anything about the apartment in the city center, the one Chloe has keys for?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Hi, Fred. It's nice to meet you. The apartment?" "No, I don't know anything about it," she replied, her voice carrying a noticeable hesitation. "Why are you asking?" "Just curious," he said. "Thanks. Maybe we'll meet later. I think Chloe plans to introduce us." Fred realized Katie knew more than she was letting on, but didn't want to reveal everything. This only confirmed his suspicions. The next time Chloe said she was meeting Katie, Fred decided to follow her. He saw her head toward the same apartment. She unlocked the door with her keys and went inside. A few minutes later, a rough-looking man entered the building. Fred didn't know what to do. He didn't want to confront them in the apartment. He didn't understand why Chloe had been telling him so little about her work lately. A couple of months ago, she quit her job and said she was starting her own business, promising to tell him about it once it was ready. Fred thought maybe she was running her business from that apartment with the man. But why wasn't she telling him about it? The next day, Fred sat in his workshop, trying to occupy his hands with small tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Chloe. Her behavior was becoming more and more mysterious, and her answers to his questions only raised new doubts. A strange man, a hidden apartment, new clothes. It was all too suspicious. And now she wanted to introduce Katie. But what would she say when she saw Katie's reaction? In the evening, when Chloe returned home, she looked particularly happy. Her face was glowing, and even Fred, despite being on edge, couldn't help but notice how stunning she looked. "Hi, darling," Chloe said as she walked into the kitchen. "How was your day?" "Nothing special," he replied, trying to sound calm. "How was yours?" "Very productive," she smiled and started pulling shopping bags out of her purse, revealing new clothes and perfume. "Can you believe it? Today, I found such an amazing partner. He has great connections, and I think it'll help us launch my business quickly." Fred nodded, masking his anger. "So, this partner will be your investor?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "No, he's just an acquaintance of Katie's," she said while unpacking her purchases. "By the way, she's coming over tomorrow evening." The next evening, Fred prepared himself to meet Katie. He was curious to see how this mysterious friend would behave in his home. When she appeared at the door, she was a petite brunette with brightly painted lips and a confident demeanor. She was short, athletic, and very attractive. "Hi, Katie," Chloe greeted, hugging her friend. "This is my husband, Fred." Fred, trying to maintain politeness, shook her hand. "Nice to finally meet you," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "Likewise," Katie replied, as if nothing unusual had happened. Dinner went smoothly, but Fred noticed how Chloe and Katie exchanged glances a few times. He decided it was time to ask a question. "Katie, what exactly are you and Chloe working on?" he asked, looking directly at her. Katie gave a faint smile. Well, we're working on a project together. It's a bit early to talk about it, but I promise it'll be something incredible, she said evasively. You'll find out soon enough. Fred asked no further questions, but his curiosity only grew. Late that night, after Chloe had fallen asleep, Fred decided to check her phone. In her gallery, he found photos of that apartment. In several pictures was the same rugged man he had seen earlier. In her messages with Katie, there were a few cryptic lines. How is he reacting? Does he suspect anything yet? Everything is going according to plan. Fred took screenshots and sent them to himself. Now he knew for sure that something was being hidden, but he couldn't understand how it was all connected. The next day, Chloe was even more cheerful. She said she needed to meet the investor again and left. Fred used the opportunity to call Katie. Hi, Katie, he said, trying to sound confident. It's Fred. Oh, hi. Is something wrong? Her voice sounded slightly surprised. I'm just curious about what you and Chloe are up to. She says you're very close, but I haven't gotten any clear answers. Katie was silent for a few seconds. Listen, Fred, if Chloe isn't telling you anything, she probably has her reasons. I think you just need to trust her, she finally said. Fred ended the call, feeling like he hadn't learned anything new. That evening, Chloe returned home with a mysterious smile on her face. What's going on? He asked, trying to sound indifferent. I wanted to tell you something, she began, but then her phone rang. Oh, this is important. I'll be quick, she said and stepped outside. Fred waited a few minutes before quietly following her. It seemed she was speaking with the same man from the photos. Yes, he doesn't suspect a thing. Everything is going according to plan, she said, her voice cold. Fred felt his blood rush to his head, but he knew he couldn't act now. Fred was sitting on the couch, staring at his phone, when he heard Chloe come home. Her face was glowing, as if she'd just won the lottery. She placed her bag on the table and gave him a quick glance. Fred, we need to talk, she said, taking off her coat. What about? He asked, looking up, trying to appear calm. I've been thinking. We've been together for a long time. It's time to think about the future, about children, for example, she smiled. But her tone was insistent. Children, he said, slightly surprised. I thought you wanted to focus on your business. The business will be fine, Chloe replied, sitting down next to him. But you need to think about earning more, too, because I'm tired of you often sitting around doing nothing. Your workshop is fine, of course, but we can't live on pennies if we want to secure our family's future. Fred felt anger boiling inside him, but held it back. I'm doing the best I can, and I love what I do, he said. Do you think my efforts mean nothing? No, I'm not saying that, Chloe quickly replied. But you need to think bigger, Fred. If we want children, we need more stability and to earn more. Especially you. I already make more than you, and I don't like it. You need to do something about it. The conversation left a bitter aftertaste, and Fred decided not to argue further. That evening, when Chloe was already asleep, he lay awake for a long time, thinking about her words. She was pressuring him, but was that really all there was to it? Late that night, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Fred got out of bed and quietly walked to the door. Standing there was Katie. Katie, what are you doing here at this hour? He asked as he opened the door. I need to talk. Is Chloe asleep? She whispered, glancing around as if afraid someone might see her. Yes, she's asleep, Fred replied. Fred let her in, and they sat in the kitchen. What's going on? He asked, trying to understand what had caused such odd behavior. Listen, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but you need to know something, Katie began. Chloe has changed a lot lately, and it's not just because of her business. She hasn't paid me my share of the money I invested in her project. What do you mean? Fred leaned in closer. That man she's working with, he's not an investor. And they're definitely not running a business together. If you know what I mean, her voice became quiet but serious. I didn't want to tell you this, but she owes me money, and I can't keep quiet anymore. At first, I thought they were trying to start something online, but now I don't even understand what they're doing. Fred felt his blood run cold. Are you sure? He asked, trying to stay composed. I've seen them together. They don't act like business partners. And although Chloe says he's my acquaintance, that's not entirely true. It's unsettling. I only introduced them not long ago because he said he was looking for new projects, Katie said, looking at him with sympathy. Why are you telling me this? Chloe is your friend, Fred asked, barely containing himself. Because you don't deserve this. You're a good man, Fred, and she? I think she's using you, Katie said as she stood up. I'd better go. Just be careful and don't trust her blindly. Fred remained sitting in the kitchen, trying to process what he just heard. His mind was racing, and it seemed nothing would ever be the same again. But he knew Katie was cunning and could easily be lying. Yet why would she? Fred sat in the living room, mulling over Katie's words. Her warnings and hints left him confused. He didn't know whether to believe her. After all, he didn't trust Katie much. She always seemed a bit manipulative, and her behavior had its own motives from the start. On the other hand, he couldn't simply ignore her words. He began to feel that something was wrong in his marriage. But why was Chloe acting so strangely? And why had he noticed certain changes in her behavior recently? The next day, Fred came home earlier than usual and saw Chloe preparing for an important meeting. She looked particularly attractive, dressed provocatively, and wearing more makeup than usual. She had on an elegant necklace Fred had never seen before. "Where are you going like that?" he asked as she walked past him, clearly enjoying how she looked. "What kind of question is that?" Chloe smiled, turning her head. "I'm just going to meet potential investors. Time is ticking, and I need to move forward." Fred felt his distrust growing. Lately, Chloe had become increasingly secretive about her affairs. He couldn't figure out what was really going on. "That necklace. I've never seen it before. Is it a new purchase?" He tried not to show his doubts. "Yes, I earned some money, so I decided to treat myself. And if you're wondering why I look like this, it's for my future investors. I need to impress them, you know?" Fred didn't like the sound of that. The emphasis on impress felt forced. It increasingly resembled the scenario Katie had described. "Well, since you're so busy with your business, I think we should have a serious talk." Fred tried to stay calm, despite his inner unease. "About what you're really doing. Katie also invested in your business, and I'm curious. Is it all true?" Chloe frowned slightly at his question. She quickly glanced at her phone, as if trying to find an answer there. Then she turned back to him with a light smile. "My partner and I sell various products online through social media. Of course, I trust Katie. She's my friend and has invested money. We're just having some disagreements right now, but that's not important. Our partnership with investors now requires more effort. We're bringing in new people, and we need to be more active to grow the business." Fred looked at her, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Chloe had always been relatively open, but now she seemed overly confident, even slightly aggressive. He decided to ask one more question, even if it wouldn't clarify much. "But still, Chloe, do you really think everything is fine with Katie? You're friends, after all?" She shrugged briefly. "We don't always see eye to eye. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong between us. I'm doing my thing, and that's all that matters. Besides, she'll still help me with my project," Chloe replied. Fred remained silent. He felt uneasy but decided not to press Chloe further. Now that he'd heard her version, he could only keep watching her behavior. But he couldn't just sit and wait for something to reveal itself. He decided that in the coming days, he would try to find out more. And while he felt trapped, he saw no other option. The next evening, Fred accidentally saw Chloe making a call in the kitchen, standing with her back to him, so he couldn't see who she was talking to. But one thing was clear. Her voice was warm and pleasant, like when she talked about her business partners. Yet something about the situation felt off, as if the call wasn't as ordinary as it seemed. Fred went to another room, not wanting to invade her privacy, but his thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. The next day, he saw new messages on her phone when she briefly went to take a shower. He hadn't intended to dig into her affairs, but his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to at least glance at the messages to see if there was anything suspicious. Fred couldn't believe his eyes. The messages she received were from the same man she worked with. But this time, they sounded much more personal. When Chloe came out of the shower, he quietly put the phone back in its place. But this discovery left him feeling unsettled. His doubts grew stronger. He decided not to take things further at the moment, though he now understood that his marriage wasn't as it had once seemed. So he began observing her behavior even more closely. And the more he watched, the more unanswered questions he found. Chloe was becoming more secretive, and her words about her business sounded less genuine than before. This was just the beginning of what would become even more complicated for Fred. Could he trust his wife? And was she really the person he thought she was? Fred sat on the couch, staring at his phone. Every call from an unknown number made his heart race. He started keeping an eye on Chloe, and her behavior became increasingly suspicious. She was less available. Her trips became more frequent, and new excuses always appeared. Yesterday, she went to another business meeting, while Fred stayed home, trying to keep his suspicions in check. He couldn't confront her directly, fearing it would come across as too aggressive. But his intuition told him something was wrong. The next morning, when Chloe returned home, she seemed particularly elated. "You look as stunning as ever," Fred said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Oh, thank you. Yesterday's meeting went wonderfully. We might have new partners soon," Chloe replied, overly enthusiastically. "And who are these partners?" Fred asked, trying not to sound suspicious. "I can't say yet. It's confidential. But I'm sure you'll find out soon," she replied, trying to maintain her smile. Fred nodded, but his mind was filled with questions. What was she hiding? Why all the secrecy? And why did it feel like she wasn't telling the whole truth? A few days later, Fred decided to act. He could no longer just sit and wait. Chloe had been very careful in her responses, but he knew there was something else hiding behind her smile. He had often noticed her phone ringing late at night, and how she would leave the room to talk. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, when Chloe went to another business meeting, Fred decided to check her phone. He knew it was risky, but felt he had no other choice. He quietly got out of bed, picked up her phone, and started scrolling. On the screen, he saw messages from an unfamiliar number. It was another man, another mysterious colleague. Fred was stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes. "When are you going to leave him?" one message read. "I don't like it when you're so far away from me," said another. Fred felt his heart sink. Now he understood that this was no coincidence. Chloe was possibly cheating on him. But the worst part was that he had no solid proof to back up his suspicions. It was all just on her phone. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to destroy everything in an instant. He decided to wait and see if there were any other clues. The next day, Chloe was at home. She was rather attentive, which only fueled Fred's doubts. She didn't ask him unnecessary questions and seemed a little nervous. Fred decided to talk to her, but not reveal his suspicions. "Chloe, you've been looking tired lately. Is everything okay?" he asked, looking into her eyes. "Oh, it's nothing. Just a lot of work, that's all." "You know how it is," she said, trying to smile again. "I understand. I just want to make sure everything's fine," Fred replied. "I don't like that you're still working so little and earning so little, Fred. I'm tired of it. Are you going to do something about it?" Chloe almost shouted at him. "Why are you pressuring me like this?" Fred asked. "Because I'm sick of all this. I want a normal life, and I feel like you're dragging me down." "This is all your fault," Chloe said harshly, sounding upset. Fred was shocked. He couldn't understand her reaction. Not only was she hiding something, but now she was blaming him for everything. "Maybe you're just tired, and you need a break," Fred said. "Maybe you're right, Fred. I'm sorry for reacting like this. There are just so many things I need to handle, and I need to be strong, but I want to feel weak sometimes," Chloe replied. Fred sat on the couch, processing what he had just heard from Chloe. His mind struggled to accept her words, as she had once been his source of support, but now her actions seemed increasingly distant. His doubts grew with each passing moment, but he still couldn't believe she would betray him. Maybe this is just a temporary crisis, he thought, trying to rationalize her behavior. Chloe was already in another room, but Fred could still hear her words echoing in his mind. He decided not to jump to conclusions this time. Yet he couldn't ignore how she, despite trying to be attentive, seemed to be pulling further away from him. He noticed her phone was constantly off, and her gaze often carried a sense of uncertainty. That evening, Chloe suddenly suggested, "You know, I think I should meet with Katie. She said she wants to talk, and I think we could resolve some issues about our business. Fred couldn't say why, but he felt her trip to Katie wasn't entirely about business. He decided not to ask anything right away, but his suspicions lingered. Fred decided not to sit idle. Chloe left for her meeting with Katie. Fred followed them. He wasn't sure what he would find, but his intuition told him it was necessary. Although he didn't want to think the worst, the fact that Chloe was with Katie, whom he barely knew, only deepened his doubts. They went to a restaurant far from home. Fred watched them from a distance, trying to remain unnoticed. At first, he noticed that Chloe and Katie were having a very personal conversation, their faces serious. Katie occasionally laughed, while Chloe looked a bit nervous. It seemed like they were discussing something important. Fred heard their laughter abruptly shift to a much more serious tone. As Fred moved closer, he caught a few phrases that made him uneasy. "You're not going to panic if they find out, right?" he heard Katie say. "No, I know it's necessary to keep everything we have. You understand, don't you?" Chloe replied. Those words immediately shocked him. He didn't know what they were discussing, but he felt it was about more than just business matters. He continued watching until he noticed another man enter the restaurant. Fred couldn't immediately see his face, but his clothes and demeanor gave him away. It was the same man whose messages Fred had seen on Chloe's phone. He recognized him from the photos. A wave of unease washed over Fred. He realized this was no coincidence, and that these meetings might have a much darker explanation. Chloe and Katie likely had their secrets, and those secrets didn't seem to involve business. When Fred returned home, he waited for Chloe to arrive. She walked into the house a couple of hours later, looking as if nothing had happened. Her smile seemed slightly forced. "How did it go?" Fred asked, trying to remain calm. "It went well. We just talked about business. Katie really wants to help with some projects," Chloe said, but her eyes didn't meet his. It was very noticeable. "But I heard you talking about something else," Fred replied, his voice cold and calm. I don't know what you're talking about, Fred. It was just a regular business conversation," Chloe tried to explain. Fred fell silent. His suspicions were only confirmed, but he still didn't have all the evidence. All these meetings, all these conversations, and again the same man who had shown up at the restaurant. He couldn't keep living in uncertainty, but he decided not to reveal his hand just yet. The next day, Fred decided he knew exactly how to find out the truth if his wife wouldn't tell him. Fred sat in the kitchen, sipping his morning coffee, watching Chloe get ready for the day. She was in her usual mood, while Fred observed her thoughtfully. "I invited some friends over today. We just want to hang out. You don't mind, do you?" Fred said, trying to keep his tone calm. Chloe, suspecting nothing, nodded. "Of course, I don't mind. It's always nice to relax when there's an opportunity." He had planned everything in advance. While Chloe went upstairs to get ready, Fred made a final call to Katie. She arrived within 30 minutes. Katie looked nervous, but Fred was confident it would be in her interest to tell the truth. "I have the money you invested in Chloe's business," Fred said, handing her the amount. "But there's a condition. You need to tell me the whole truth, the truth Chloe has been hiding from me." Katie was silent at first, as if she were weighing her words. But eventually, she agreed and began to speak. "It's all been a lie, Fred," she said, lowering her voice. "Chloe hasn't been running an online sales business. She's been taking men to that same apartment where you saw her with that investor. Those weren't business meetings. She was entertaining them for money and cheating on you. And that's not all. She went to various business events with them, getting paid for it." Fred felt his heart clench in pain but kept listening, trying to understand what had happened. "Are you serious?" he said, his voice filled with hurt. "She really did that?" "Yes," Katie confirmed with a nod. "And I was part of it too. We both were." Fred couldn't believe his ears. He had heard the truth, but it was hard to process that his wife had hidden so much from him. He was shattered, but he wanted to learn more. He pulled out his phone and showed Katie the screenshots of the messages he had found. On the screen were texts where Chloe discussed plans with other men. "Is this you?" Fred asked, pointing to one of the messages. "Here, where you're arranging a meeting with one of these men?" Chloe, who had just come downstairs, overheard their conversation. She couldn't believe Katie had started revealing everything. Outrage instantly consumed her. "Katie, what are you saying?" Chloe exclaimed. "You have no right. This isn't true. You're supposed to be my friend." Katie, unfazed, looked back at her and said, "You've lied enough, Chloe. This wasn't just you. We both did this. You're not alone in this game." Fred looked at them both, even more shocked, as everything took a new turn. It turned out Katie had been part of the deception as well. She had, seemingly accidentally, become Chloe's accomplice in her secret dealings. And now that everything was coming to light, Fred didn't know what to do. "This is all lies," Chloe denied, unable to contain her emotions any longer. "It's all your fault, Fred. I'm tired of being with you. You don't earn enough. You do nothing. That's why I had to find other ways for myself. I cheated on you, and it wasn't just once, and I don't regret it." Fred stood there, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a deep, cruel betrayal he couldn't have imagined even in his worst nightmares. "How could you?" Fred said, trying to hold back tears that were welling up in his eyes. "We built our life together, and you destroyed it all. Why didn't you tell me any of this earlier?" "Because I couldn't. Because I thought you wouldn't understand. You didn't listen to me. You just sat at home while I had to take on all the responsibilities. I want more, Fred. I want more than you could ever give me." Fred couldn't believe it. Chloe's words were painful, and he felt that all his efforts to be a better husband, all his hard work, had been in vain. Fred woke up in the morning with a clear purpose. He knew exactly what he needed to do to restore his dignity and ensure that his wife's betrayal didn't go unpunished. For months, Chloe hadn't just been lying to him. She had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He was determined to make sure she could no longer deceive him, and even if it meant the end of their marriage, he needed to feel victorious, to regain his moral high ground. That day, he maintained an outward calm. The night before, Chloe hadn't seemed suspicious at all. In fact, she had laughed when Fred suggested saving their marriage and promised not to hold a grudge if she continued her dealings with other men. She had felt relieved, but Fred knew this was just part of his plan. "You know, I don't want to fight about this anymore," he said calmly. "I'm ready to accept your choices. If you want, you can do whatever you like, even cheat on me for money. I don't care. I just want to keep our marriage. But there's one condition. We need to talk to a marriage counselor. I think it'll be helpful for both of us." Chloe sighed but agreed. She was confident this consultation would help mend their relationship, especially if Fred was willing to compromise so easily. She didn't notice how quickly she was losing control of the situation. "Fine, I agree. Let's do it. Therapy can't hurt," she said, brushing aside her doubts. Fred called and scheduled an appointment with a counselor. But unlike what she expected, this wasn't a regular therapy session. Fred had no intention of helping Chloe mend their relationship. His goal was to corner her and expose all her lies. When Chloe arrived at the therapist's office, she saw a strange man standing by the door. "Good afternoon. I'm William, and I'm here for the consultation," he said with a cold look that promised nothing good. Chloe was confused. She had expected a therapist, but instead, there was a stranger. She looked at Fred, who stood next to her with a completely emotionless expression. "What kind of joke is this?" she asked suspiciously, trying to understand what was happening. Fred didn't answer. He only gave a faint smile and nodded toward William. "You're not mistaken. He is a therapist, but he's here to talk to you about betrayal. Real betrayal. Now everything will fall into place." William began to speak, his tone serious. "Good day, ma'am. You've come here to learn how to deal with betrayal, but perhaps you didn't realize that betrayal is more than just physical infidelity. It's emotional manipulation, abuse of trust, lying. And it seems, ma'am, that you're already on the path to understanding this." At first, Chloe didn't understand what was happening. She was at a loss for words. She looked at Fred, but his gaze was cold. He looked at her as though she were a stranger, someone he no longer loved. And then it all became clear. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. I didn't know you knew all of this." Fred stood up and approached the table where some documents were laid out. He pulled out a few papers and threw them in front of Chloe. Each one contained photos and messages proving her infidelity. "This is everything," he said coldly. "Here's your truth. Here's the evidence of what you've been doing behind my back. I wasn't just sitting at home. You were betraying me. And now, I'm taking everything you earned with your so-called business. This is your wealth, and I'm taking it. And our marriage? It's over." Chloe was stunned. Her legs gave way, and she sank into a chair, devastated. She tried to speak, but no words came out. "Fred, please. I didn't mean for this to happen. I couldn't take it anymore. I thought I could find happiness this way," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. Fred's expression didn't change. "I don't love you anymore, Chloe. You betrayed me, and I don't want to see you again. You're not worth my time. This is the end." William, observing the moment, realized his role was complete. He looked at Fred, who said nothing more and walked out of the office. Chloe was left alone, her eyes full of tears. She realized that everything she had done had led to this moment. Everything was destroyed. She could only sit there, reflecting on how many chances she had lost because of her greed and betrayal. How would you react if you discovered that your partner had been deceiving you all this time and cheating on you with other men for money?